Hello, welcome back to Young Heretics. This is episode 2, the second episode of this podcast. Surprise, surprise, it was not just a one-off thing. Here we are again. We will actually be here every week, if you can believe it. I can hardly believe it myself, but it's happening. It's real. This is the podcast where we bring you Western culture without the culture wars. I've kind of come to think of it as a place where we meet social justice warriors, not with an olive branch, but with a shrug. I outlined in my first episode where I stand on the culture wars. I think it's quite clear and has been clear for a while that I don't really care about identity politics and queer theory and feminist theory and so on. But I also want to make clear that I'm really not going to spend a lot of time arguing about that because I don't think it's helpful most of the time to argue with stupid people. And I would rather spend time reading great books and talking about the West. So that is what we do here on Young Heretics. This week, we're going to talk about the biblical book, The Prophecy of Isaiah. And I'm going to give you a disclaimer at the beginning, which is that I studied in the UK. That's where I did all my graduate work. And in England, as you know, they talk kind of funny and they say some words differently than we say them. And the way that the British pronounce Isaiah is Isaiah. And that is how I pronounce Isaiah most of the time. I'm going to try really, really hard to say Isaiah. I'm trying to learn to talk like an American again. But you will have to forgive me that sometimes I'm going to say Isaiah. Last week we did Homer. And I want to talk actually first about why that pairing is important, why we're starting our first 2 episodes with our oldest extant ancient Greek poet, and one of the central texts of the Hebrew Bible. So this is a podcast about Western culture and the West. And there are some people, Donna Zuckerberg is a prominent one, Mark Zuckerberg's sister, and there are others in the Academy, Sarah Bond, Kwame Anthony Appiah, who have argued that either the West doesn't exist, it's what you call a social construct that's made up, and or it's made up in order to be racist, in order to exclude Muslims and Chinese people who are typically, Muslim culture, Chinese culture is not typically thought of as part of the West. That is a good example of the kind of argument that I am not going to be talking about or engaging with on this podcast. It's dumb, whatever, the West exists, it's good. That's something we all know. However, there is a legitimate question to be asked, which is, what is the West? What are we talking about when we say the West? We all have a set of inclinations, intuitions about what we mean when we say the West, but it bears thinking about just what exactly it is. So one very long-standing way of talking about what the West means is to say that it refers to the cultural products and legacy of Athens and Jerusalem. So those are 2 great cities from the ancient world, which have had just this vastly outsized influence on culture, philosophy, thought, and history, given how small they were, and in the case of Athens, for how short a period of time they were really powerful and dominant. Athens had this kind of hothouse cultural flourishing, really dating to right after they defeated this giant Persian empire, this Eastern empire in the 470s BC. And then in the 5th century, they had what's called the High Classical period, which was this moment when all of these, cultural, these Socrates, Plato, Aeschylus, Euripides, all of these guys were working and learning in Athens during and just after the 5th century BC. So we talk about Athens, and then we talk about Jerusalem, which is obviously the capital city of Israel, the Holy Land, which Christians and Jews both believe was given to the Jews, to the ancient Jews, by God to inhabit and to act out a relationship with God in. Christians and Jews believe that this was a particular relationship that God selected with a nation of Israel, to establish his relationship with humankind and to reveal himself to the world. And we're going to get to a lot more about that in this episode, but that's just by way of explaining that Athens and Jerusalem are kind of, when people say that, they're kind of a shorthand, not just for everything that happened in Athens in the 400s and in Jerusalem in the 10th century BC and thereabouts, but also for everything that happened afterwards that was influenced by that, especially when those 2 great cultures, the sort of Greco-Roman culture and the Judeo-Christian culture were united in the Roman Empire. Obviously, Rome was very enamored of Greece and imitated a lot of its cultural practices. And then, of course, especially after the conversion of Constantine, the Christianity became a powerful force, the powerful force in the Roman Empire. And so we think about Christendom, but we also think about sort of Athens and Jerusalem uniting and getting exported through the Roman Empire to become and to leave behind the heritage that we now call the West. So people who consider themselves inheritors of Athens and Jerusalem are really in many ways Westerners. And one important thing about that is it's not actually a geographical thing, right? We're not talking about just sort of everybody in the Western Hemisphere. It's also not a racial thing. I mean, I think one of the great Westerners in the world right now is Cardinal Robert Sarah, who's a Guinean prelate, an African prelate in the Catholic Church. So it's not a question really of race or location, although there are certain nations and locations where the West has thrived and flourished, and others with which it's typically been in antipathy. But that's why we're doing Isaiah now. And there's one other thing to kind of note, which is that these two cities, Athens and Jerusalem, and the kind of two ideologies that they represent, have not always themselves been on the best possible terms, right? Tertullian, one of the earliest church fathers, one of the earliest Christians, is famous for having said, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" And this goes both ways, right? Christians, even now, tend to sort of be skeptical about, well, pagans, do we really want to learn things from pagans? Can they really have known anything? Or is the Bible just the only source of truth? And likewise, that tends to make Christians look kind of small-minded to non-Christians. And so there's a long-standing ancient history of sort of Athens being skeptical of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem being skeptical of Athens. My own response to this is, look, I'm a Christian, so I believe that the ultimate source of truth and authority is in the Bible. I also believe that God created the entire universe and that all the universe was created through Christ, as it says in John 1. And so I believe not only in the special revelation of the Bible, but also in the general revelation that has been given to all people and specifically to certain peoples at certain times. So this is why, Christians have also, many other Christians besides Tertullian, have been big fans of the Greeks, right? Aquinas famously called Aristotle the philosopher because he just thought he was that good. This is the great medieval Christian philosopher, was greatly enamored of Greek philosophy. And that's kind of more the attitude that I, as a Christian, take. If you're not a Christian, it just doesn't do any good to say that the Bible is just backwards, hokey stuff. It's one of the deepest sources of wisdom anywhere in the entire world, and certainly in the West. It is one of the two pillars, along with Homer. Just like it would make no sense to read classical Greco-Roman literature without Homer, it would make absolutely no sense to read almost any Western literature without the Bible. The Bible is a lodestone and a pillar. Whether or not, we're not actually going to talk too much about whether you accept the theological claims of traditional Christianity or of Judaism. Whether or not you accept those claims, you cannot be literate without having read the whole Bible. And that's, what did they say? That's a hill that I'm going to die on. Okay, the Bible. You must read it. Here is the book of Isaiah, right? The book of the prophecy of Isaiah. This is a prophecy and a book of the Bible that I'm particularly attached to. I have written my own English translation of it from the Hebrew, and I'm going to read from that translation from time to time here. If you want to read the whole thing, you can go to, it's rejoice-evermore.com is my website where I have released that. So if you just look that up, you will find it. But one of the things I think that people tend not to get about Isaiah, both Christians and non-Christians, is you open up this book. It's very long. It's 66 chapters long. It's one of the major prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And people open it up and there's lots of very beautiful poetic language in it. A lot of it sounds very beautiful. We know it's very important, so we kind of want to pretend like we understand it. We hear it maybe read at Christmas, right? Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. We hear these readings from Isaiah rather. And we want to pretend like we understand it because it's so beautiful and so lovely. But you don't really understand Isaiah unless you understand the history behind him and where he comes in the Hebrew Bible. So that's the first thing, actually. I think the most important thing before you start reading this prophecy is to understand that. So the Hebrew Bible is split into three sections. Typically, the whole Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh, and that's a kind of amalgam of three different words. The Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, the Navi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, so things like Psalms and Song of Solomon. So obviously Isaiah is a prophet, so he's in that middle section, the Nevi'im or the Navi'im. And the prophets lived all throughout history. The word prophet doesn't actually mean telling the future, right? So that's the first thing, is we're not just dealing here with predictions about what's going to happen. What it really means is speaking forth. And God in the Bible describes in Deuteronomy sort of how he's going to choose his prophets to speak forth basically on his behalf. So rather than coming down and thundering immediately in the presence of all the people, which has been known to like kill people, so that would be bad, instead he ordains these prophets to go forth and speak his truth among his people of Israel. And so that's who Isaiah, that's who Isaiah is. He's one of the most important prophets, especially for Christians, because a lot of what he says seems to point to Jesus, seems to Christians to point to Jesus. And he was a man, we don't know terribly much about him, but we know that he lived in the 700s BC in Jerusalem, which was that capital city of Israel, where King David, who was sort of the great the first great, not the first king of Israel, but the first great king of Israel, David in the 10th century, had been ruling, and his tribe, the tribe of Judah, had been ruling in Jerusalem since then. But by Isaiah's day, that kingdom of Israel has split into two parts. So you've got the southern part, which is sometimes called Judah, because it's where the tribe of Judah reigns in Jerusalem. And there's actually only two biblical tribes of Israel that live there at this point, because the other 10 Jewish tribes have split off to the north into a kingdom that is sometimes called Samaria, because that's the name of the capital. So you've got Samaria in the north, you've got Judah and Jerusalem in the south. And Isaiah lives in Jerusalem, which is kind of treated in many ways in the Bible as the legit Israel, right? I mean, the kings of Judah are kind of thought of as the legit kings, and then the kings of Samaria are sort of exiled as usurpers. So Isaiah lives in the legit place. We don't know too much about him. His dad's name is Amos, but he seems maybe to have been kind of among the Jewish nobility. He's able to get audiences with kings, but we don't know a ton about him. And we do know, though, from what he tells us, that Jerusalem in his time is kind of a total mess. It's rife with injustice. That's Isaiah's main concern. One of the things he's very angry about is that the rich have been annexing land so that there's no space for the poor. And there was supposed to be this special concern for the poor in ancient Jewish society. And Isaiah accuses the rich of sort of destroying that by gobbling up all the land for themselves. But also there's just kind of general license. People don't rely on God. They don't think of God as sort of central to their lives. And the first thing that we don't often appreciate about Isaiah is that a lot of it is just real fire and brimstone, angry stuff about just how devastatingly bad Jerusalem has gotten. So that's what I'm going to start with here is a few of those kind of fire and brimstone lines that you don't often hear like inscribed on greeting cards at Christmas. This is from chapter 3 from my translation. And it's a chapter which has a long description of the daughters of Zion. So in Hebrew, when you say daughter of something, daughter of Chaldea, Babylon, daughter of Israel, daughter of Jerusalem, what you mean is kind of the whole people. It's like a representation of this whole nation. And so the daughters of Zion was the holy hill in Jerusalem. And this is meant to sort of be just people of Jerusalem, but it's also a description of the real sort of women who go about in the city of Jerusalem. So it's this kind of double image. And this is verses 16 to 13. Isaiah says, "And God says, because of how Zion's daughters put on airs and strut around with necks outstretched, batting their eyes, sashaying as they go with bangles jangling on their feet, the master will disfigure their scalps, these daughters of Zion, and God will lay their cavities bare," which is pretty intense. I mean, lay their cavities bare basically means exactly what you think it means. And this is like God bringing a reckoning to not just to sort of promiscuous women, but to Israel or to Jerusalem as a promiscuous woman. And the kind of loss, this terrible sorrow that Isaiah has over the loss of righteousness in God's kingdom. This was supposed to be the great hope for the world, right? Jerusalem was supposed to be where righteousness lived and God dwelled and ruled. And it's just utter disaster. It looks hideous to Isaiah. Isaiah becomes a prophet in 740 BC, which is the year King Uzziah died. And we know this because he tells us. So King Uzziah was a king in the line of Judah in Jerusalem. He dies in 740. And in chapter 6, which is kind of an insane chapter that I'm going to read a lot of, Isaiah tells us the story about how God made him a prophet. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read a lot of it. And in this case, I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version rather than my translation. Chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs, this is a Hebrew word meaning like burning angels, these tremendously powerful beings. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So this is one of the first things to note about Isaiah, is that it's not as if he's standing outside of Jerusalem and condemning Jerusalem, right? People kind of read him that way, as if he's just like shaking his finger at all these bad people in Jerusalem. But he counts himself among those bad people in Jerusalem. He is probably among the nobility. He might be just as immoral in his own eyes as everybody else is. So it's this question of kind of how can a sinful man in a sinful people speak the truth of God? And so then comes this answer in verse 6. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go. So now, right, again, this is an insane story, and it's only if you've heard it a bunch of times that it doesn't seem completely bonkers. This is a live coal, like hot ember, in sort of being shoved in your mouth because your mouth is too sinful to speak the word of God, and now you have to be burned in the mouth. And this is an image, right, of what it takes to really come to grips with God and with God's truth, and to understand. In Isaiah's eyes, that requires being scourged. It requires this terrible pain that is implicit in realizing your own sin and the sin around you. This anguish of understanding just how bad things are comes with this searing pain, and then forgiveness, right? And then God anoints him or chooses him and sends him out. And here's what he tells Isaiah to say. This is this first prophecy from chapter 6 that Isaiah is told to say. Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears and shut their eyes so that they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed. And he says, I'm going to cut the people down. Even if a 10th part remain in it, it will be burned again like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. So this is a deep mystery. It's one of the deepest mysteries of the Hebrew Bible, that sometimes God in it hardens people's hearts. It's a way, I think, of ancient Jewish reckoning with what we would call the problem of evil. And I'm not even going to try to sit here and resolve the problem of evil for you. I don't think Isaiah is dumb enough to sit here and try to resolve the problem of evil for you. So I'm not going to be dumb enough to try that either. I don't know what the answer is to how we can understand God's justice in this passage, but I do know that the point of it for me is that things have gotten so bad in Jerusalem that the only way out is through. Right? God, that's the point of that bit at the end. The stump, the holy seed is its stump. He has to cut the whole forest down before he can plant something new. And that imagery of new branches or new plants springing up is going to become the imagery of the Messiah that comes to save Jerusalem. So again, this is one of the ballsiest books of the Bible because it just faces up to this. It doesn't actually necessarily answer like with philosophical precision how the whole thing's supposed to work. But it's like sometimes things are shit, right? Sometimes things suck. And there needs to be a book of the Bible that reckons deeply enough with that. And the first thing I think Isaiah says is, yes, it's that bad, and the only way out is through. The Christian tradition interprets this as sin, right? This as original sin of the world is just that bad. So that personal story of Isaiah's personal call is then folded in the book into this massive geopolitical story. So after Uzziah dies, we have Jotham, his son, who's kind of not that important. And then we have Ahaz and Hezekiah. Ahaz is the real linchpin because he really stuffs things up. He is confronted with this terrible crisis. He comes onto the throne very young, and the minute he's there, he's confronted with this crisis, which is that Samaria, northern Israel, is making an alliance with Damascus. And you hear a lot about these two powers in Isaiah that make an alliance so that they can defend against Assyria, which is this just juggernaut empire to the east, which outshines all of them and is getting hungry for territory and is making its way toward Jerusalem. So Damascus and northern Israel, Samaria, try to strong arm Ahaz into making an alliance with them against Assyria. And Isaiah basically comes and says, no, don't let yourself get caught up in the sort of calculations of geopolitics. Trust God and listen to me. You may well imagine what the consequence of that is. Ahaz does not trust God, does not listen to Isaiah. He makes a foolish treaty with Tiglath-Pileser III, who is at that time the king of Assyria. This goes horribly wrong because Assyria is then conquered by Babylon. And Babylon famously conquers Jerusalem and sends the Jews into a horrendous exile from 597 to 538, out of which finally Persia comes, having conquered the Babylonians, and Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the leader of Persia, Cyrus, the leader of Persia, sets the Jews free. And Cyrus is named in Isaiah, which is an important bit that we'll get to later. But before we do, and before we close this out, I just want to read one more bit of Isaiah from chapter 4. Because this is the part of Isaiah that everybody reads, and I don't think that it really carries its full weight unless you've talked about all the stuff that we've just talked about, this terrible desolation, this anguish of exile, the true dreadfulness of what goes on. This is chapter 4, and a vision of the last days, or potentially also a vision of the days when the Jews will be rescued from the exile in Babylon. He says, on that day, the branch of God, this is my translation, the branch of God is the Messiah, right? On that day, the branch of God will unfurl into majesty and splendor, and the fruit of the earth into excellence and beauty for Israel's refugees. Then it happens, the survivors in Zion and the ones still left in Jerusalem, so left after the exile, right, will be spoken of as sacred, every one of them inscribed into life in Jerusalem. When my master scrubs away the grime from Zion's daughters, so all of Israel, and the blood from Jerusalem scours it away from her core with a breath of justice, with a burning spirit, then God creates over the whole structure of Mount Zion, over the congregations called together, cloud in the daylight and smoke and the brilliance of fire, a flare in the night, yes, a canopy above all majesty. And for shade from the scorching heat in the daylight, there will be a tent, a place to take shelter and hide from the downpour, from the rain. Obviously, I think you should believe the Bible is true. Obviously, I believe the Bible is true. But if that's not where you're at right now, you would still be a fool to toss this repository of wisdom aside. This is a testament from 700 BC to facing down the absolute worst that life can offer and hoping in the goodness of God and the order and the justice, the ultimate order and the justice of life and the universe. That's the point of all the fancy poetry in Isaiah, right? It's not so that you can read it and smile and be like, well, I don't really know what this means, but it's nice. Every word of it is referring to very specific historical events and to holding defiantly onto your faith and onto your hope in spite of just complete disaster. That is all I'm going to say about the actual content of the prophecy of Isaiah. You should obviously go and read it. You should read my translation if you want, or the New Revised Standard Version is pretty good. 66 chapters. I'm going to say one brief thing about the authorship. Because interestingly, we have two authors, Homer and now Isaiah, who people have said we don't really know if this is one person or more than one person. This is true of Isaiah too. Since about the 1800s, since the sort of late 1800s in Europe and America, it has become more and more fashionable to believe that these 66 chapters were not all written by one person. Typically, the book is clearly divided into two sections. Chapters 1 to 39 are sort of the sections of desolation and condemnation, and chapters 40 to 66 are sort of the hope and consolation chapters. But ever since, especially this German scholar Bernard Juhm, who lived in the 1800s, there has been a growing trend to believe that this can't all be by one person. There are three reasons why. The first and most important one is historical, which is that Cyrus and other such historical figures and events are named that did not live during the time of Isaiah, right? Isaiah didn't know anybody by the name of Cyrus, and yet Cyrus is named as the liberator of the Jews. Two, there are some literary reasons people think that they can discern certain themes that exist in parts of the book and not in others. And then finally, there are grammatical reasons. People think that the structure of the Hebrew language changes across the different books, and that certain parts must be written by what's called Proto-Isaiah, which is the real Isaiah. And then there's Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah, third Isaiah. Now, this is not what I believe to be true about Isaiah. I don't think that if it were true, it would be a disaster for biblical authority. God could have spoken through multiple people that all got amalgamated into a book called Isaiah just as easily as he could have spoken through one person. But I think that the consensus, the certainty about the consensus, kind of seems like protesting too much to me. I mean, the historical stuff is like, yeah, if you don't believe in prophecy, if you don't believe that people can tell the future, it's a problem that Cyrus is named. If you do believe in prophecy, it's not a problem. And if that's not a problem, then everything else is just kind of silly. Like, one author can write a million different kinds of work. There are different kinds of work in this book. There's poetry, there's history, there's narrative, and so on. And those kinds of work call for different kinds of artistry. And Isaiah is obviously a tremendous literary stylist. No matter how many people you think you were, there's obviously tremendous literary genius in here. And so, of course, one person could have written in multiple different grammatical styles, emphasizing multiple different themes. All of these things seem clear. I mean, you wouldn't say that Shakespeare couldn't have written histories and comedies and tragedies all. He obviously wrote them all. He was a great genius. So really, it comes down to whether you believe in prophecy, I think. But I'm not going to labor the point too much, except to say that go and examine the evidence for yourself. If you think that it points toward multiple authors, that's fine. But don't let people scare you into not thinking it's one person just because they treat you like you're dumb if you feel that way, right? That's a classical tactic. But for over 2,000 years, basically everybody smart and sophisticated, and there were a lot of smart and sophisticated people in the ancient world, have thought this was by one author. So the notion that like nobody smart thinks it's by one person is just a great example of what I call chronological chauvinism, right? The belief that now is the enlightened time and everything else is dumb in the past. That's all I have to say about Isaiah. We are going to switch now to a new segment, which is going to be a staple every week, which is the mailbag. So we're introducing this week, but we'll do it every week. I will take questions. I get a lot of questions like on Twitter and Facebook and over email that I am really, really bad at answering, even though they're often very interesting and sophisticated and smart questions. I'm just a terrible correspondent in that way. And this seemed like a really good way to start to answer people's questions and hopefully do so in a way that would be personal, but also helpful for everybody. So some of these questions will relate back to the material that we talk about in the main episode, but some of them are just going to be sort of life, the universe, and everything questions. So if you do have a mailbag question, make sure you tweet it at me and use the hashtag Young Heretics so that I can see it and collect them all into one big mailbag. But I have a bunch already that I'm going to also work through. So here's the first one. This is from Tyler, who is a digital friend of mine. He's a remote friend of mine on Twitter. I've never met him in person, but he says, my question is, with academia downplaying the important lit to prop up quirky ones for critical theory reasons, how does one go about understanding literary moments throughout history? Are the old categories, romanticism, modernism, etc., sufficient? is there a book recommendation? I know I'm basically asking for a college level course. Sorry, any thoughts on the matter would be of great interest to me. Well, you don't have to be sorry. This is a great question. And it speaks more generally to sort of as the traditional education system in this country and Europe further deteriorates, it becomes harder and harder to trust kind of the company line on various literary trends, historical trends, and so on. And when Tyler refers to the old categories, I assume he means sort of the old periods or ways of dividing up literary movements in history, Romanticism, modernism, etc. Well, I kind of think that those were never sufficient, as Tyler asked. Like, I don't think that you can understand what's happening in a given literary period just by slapping a label, Romanticism or modernism, on it. But I do think that those movements generally do exist, and those are useful to think about. I have one book recommendation that I can just wholeheartedly put out there, which is a book called From Dawn to Decadence by Jacques Barzin. And it's 500 years of Western cultural life, so it won't give you the ancients, but it does include in itself a huge bibliography and a bunch of other stuff to go read. And Barzin, who I think was in his 90s when he wrote this absolutely compendious study of what he calls the decadence of Western cultural life, and he makes a good case for that, by the way, unfortunately, Barzin not only gives a kind of argument about how the history of culture and literature has evolved over the course of time, but also will help you to get your bearings. The real thing, though, and this is one of the great tricks, is you can read these surveys and you can start to kind of understand how scholars and historians tend to divide up literary history, but those words won't have a ton of meaning to you unless you just read primary texts, right? The original sources that are being talked about, which will give you authority to know whether people are trying to pull one over on you in the name of critical theory, discourse, or feminism or whatever, and trying to obscure, the importance of male authors at the expense, for the sake of female authors or whatever. That's the only way to have the power in your actual hands. And the funny thing is that, I think, and this is going to sound really curmudgeonly, I think that we just don't even grasp how much you have to read just as like a regular citizen. I'm not even talking about like if you want to go do a PhD or whatever. I'm talking about just like to be well read. People used to read so much more than we do. And I'm old fashioned this way. It's still better to sit down and read an entire book than it is to read 5 articles, even long, good articles by excellent writers that you found on Twitter or whatever. So I know that's like not a great doctor. I know it's kind of a scoldy doctor prescription, but it's still true. And it pays these tremendous dividends, because then you can sort of, it's like going, reading these surveys is like looking at a map, but reading the books is like walking through the territory. And that once you walk through a territory, you have understanding of sort of what people mean by Romanticism and modernism and so on. And you can question different people on it. So that's my main recommendation, Tyler, is read Dawn to Decadence, but then go read the actual books and try to understand why people have chosen to group them in certain ways rather than others. Okay, that's our first mailbag. And you should, as I say, you should tweet at me with hashtag Young Heretics and give me some more mailbag questions so that I can answer them. As always, I'm incredibly grateful to my friend Jonathan Hay, who has helped to put this podcast together tremendously. I'm grateful to Jake Gannon, and I'm really grateful to my employers at the Claremont Institute for supporting me in all of this and helping me also to put this project together. If you like this stuff, you probably will also like Claremont Institute stuff. We have 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. I write there a lot, but so do also many other extremely smart and interesting people. So you should go there. You should also, and this is important, subscribe to this podcast, to Young Heretics, wherever you get your podcasts. You should give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. If you are on iTunes, that's tremendously helpful to us. And hopefully it will be helpful also for you to get new episodes as they appear. That's it for episode 2 of Young Heretics. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.